Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Lena Dlayhead and today I want to talk to you about diagnosing pericardial effusions and tamponade on bedside echo. First, we need to determine if the fluid we're seeing is actually in the pericardial space or the pleural space. And once we're confident in diagnosing a pericardial effusion, we need to figure out if there's any tamponade physiology seen on the bedside ultrasound. It's preferred to use the phased array probe, the cardiac probe, to look at the beating heart. It has a higher frame per second and will give you great images. Also, it has a smaller footprint, so it does really well between the ribs and gives you great windows. Now, in terms of what views to get, well, you could see the effusion depending on its size pretty much in any cardiac view. You should always look for multiple views in order to get a good estimate of how much fluid you're seeing around the heart. It's like you're getting the full 3D view of the heart. And what we're looking for is a black hypoechoic stripe of fluid around the heart. So let's figure out if this fluid we're seeing in the pericardial space or pleural space. So the best way to determine that is to obtain a parasternal long axis of the heart, like you can see here, and you really want to find your landmark, which is the descending aorta. Basically, any fluid that tracks anterior to this, in front of this, so you can see a black strip of fluid here, and it's going anterior to the descending aorta, that fluid's going to be in the pericardial space. And any fluid tracking behind it is going to be in the pleural space. So let's take a look at another example. Here you can see a still image of a parasternal long axis view. You determine the descending aorta. You see a black hypoechoic strip of fluid, and when you trace it anteriorly, it goes in front of the descending aorta, which makes this a pericardial fluid. But look here, we can also see black fluid that is tracking posterior to the descending aorta, and in fact this patient has both pericardial as well as pleural effusion. Here's another example. You can see hypoechoic fluid that is tracking anterior to the descending aorta, which makes this a pericardial effusion. Alright, now the question we really need to answer as emergency physicians is there a tamponade physiology on the bedside ultrasound after I found that fluid? Let's take a step back and answer the question, what is tamponade? So to put it simply, tamponade is when the fluid in the pericardium exerts pressure that exceeds the pressure in the cardiac chambers and impairs filling. This leads to decreased cardiac output and hemodynamic compromise. The size of the effusion doesn't tell if the patient has tamponade or not. It is not how much fluid, but how fast it accumulates, and it also depends on the compliance of the pericardium itself. So if tamponade happens when the pressure in the pericardium impairs filling of the chambers, we expect the right side to be affected first, since it's a low pressure system. And it makes sense to see the right atrial filling impaired, right? Because the right atrium has the least pressure of all four chambers of the heart. So the atrium fills in systole, if you can remember the cardiac cycle. And so when the tricuspid valve is closed, that is the phase of systole, that's when you expect the right atrium to fill. So if you see impairment of that filling, or in other words, collapsing of that wall in systole, that means it's being impaired by the pressure outside, right? So we have to worry about tamponade. So right atrial collapse in systole points towards tamponade. In the same way, the right ventricle fills in diastole. So if the pressure in the pericardium impairs the right ventricular filling, that also points towards tamponade. Another finding you can see is a plump IVC, because blood return to the right atrium is impaired. So it makes sense to see a large IVC that does not collapse with inspiration, in a spontaneously breathing patient, of course. There's another finding, which is Doppler pulseless paradoxus, but I'm actually not going to go into it in this video. So let's see some examples of tamponade. So here we see a heart that is in the parasternal long view, all right? We've determined that this is pericardial fluid. And I'm going to try to slow it down for you so we can take a look and see what I'm looking at right now. Just because I can't see the tricuspid valve, I'm going to use the mitral valve as a surrogate. So the mitral valve, which is here. So let's see, when the mitral valve is open, I don't see any collapse in the right ventricle. So that tells me that there's probably no signs of tamponade here. This view, you can see the mitral valve, see aortic valve, and this is the right ventricle. So let me slow it down for you a little bit. And when you see the valve open, right? So the mitral valve open, which means the tricuspid valve is open. Look up there. You can see the right ventricle collapsing in diastole. This is very concerning for tamponade physiology. Let's take another look at another example. Right here you can see a tachycardic heart with a large amount of effusion surrounding it. And even without slowing it down, if you look at the right atrium, you can see it collapsing, you can see the right ventricular collapsing. But the question is, are they collapsing in their corresponding cardiac cycles? So the ventricle should collapse in diastole, the atrium should collapse in systole in order to let us worry about tamponade. So let's take a closer look. Let me try to slow it down even more. Okay, so right there, you could see the tricuspid valve closed, right? So this is where we try to look at the atrium, and we could definitely see atrial collapse right there, which is very concerning for tamponade. Now, if we try to get the diastole when the tricuspid valve is opening, and you can see right there, tricuspid valve is open, but look at the right ventricle. It is collapsing. It is really small, right? And so this is really concerning for tamponade. Here, you could see, again, a peristernal long view, and we're looking at the right ventricle up there. And if we slow it down and use the mitral valve as a surrogate to our tricuspid valve, right there is the mitral valve open, so the tricuspid valve should be open. And you can see right ventricular collapse. So here, this is concerning for tamponade. Here is another very dramatic example of a pericardial effusion with concerns for tamponade. So first of all, I want to point out that this swinging heart that goes back and forth is actually what causes your electrical alternance on an EKG, because the heart itself goes closer and further away from the chest wall, thereby altering your amplitudes on an EKG. All right, so let's take a look. This is your apical four chamber. The right side of the heart is right there. So I'm going to try to pause it or slow it down right there. So your tricuspid valve is closed, and you could see indentation and collapse of the right atrium, and that is really concerning for tamponade. All right, and I briefly talked about the IVC. So this is an example of a very plump IVC that is not collapsing with inspiration, and this should signify tamponade physiology if there's any fluid around the heart, because the fluid is not going back into the right atrium, so there's impairment of the filling. In fact, some studies suggest that if you see an IVC that does collapse by more than 50% on inspiration, that is 97% predictive that there's no cardiac tamponade. So if you see this, worry about cardiac tamponade. If you see it collapsing, maybe not so much. So just to sum it up, if you see fluid anterior to the descending aorta, that's pericardial. If you see right atrium collapsing in systole, that is concerning for a tamponade. A right ventricle that is collapsing in diastole, that is concerning for a tamponade. And we talked about the IVC and how if it is plump and non-collapsing, you should worry about tamponade. Please don't hesitate to email me with questions, comments, concerns. I welcome them all. There's my Twitter handle. And also, please follow us on POCUS on UMEM on Instagram. I'll see you later. Thanks.